Well, welcome to everyone to this second session of the Creation Care 101 class with the Creation Care Collaborative. It's good to have Sue with us tonight, and we'll do some introductions here a little bit later. I'm Noni Strand. I chair the Lutherans Restoring Creation Mission Table for the Central State Synod. So as we did last week, we will have some recorded information and education from the Creation Care Collaborative. And then we'll have breakout times so that we can do some discussion. And I see Lisa's joining us tonight too. That's wonderful. Hi, Lisa. We will meet together for about 90 minutes and we'll have some wrap up time at the end. Are there any questions before we get started tonight? We kind of do move pretty rapidly, but want to address anything. Sue, I can talk to you a little bit more about those 3.5 Earths and how that relates to carbon. We can talk more about that. Any other questions or things that were left over from last week? Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and jump right into the video. And then the next time we stop, we'll have discussion and we'll have time to do some more introductions so that you guys can get to know each other as well. So we'll get started.
Well, as everyone's coming in, also just wanted to, again, officially welcome everyone to Creation Care 101 Session 2. And of course, we're welcoming over 100 churches from across the country, across 10 denominations. And there were lots and lots of folks at the earlier session today, and lots of folks that are going to be listening in. So welcome, welcome. It is so wonderful to see you, and great job having extra folks sign up in the meantime.
Yeah, I think we had over
people signed up in the last couple of weeks. So there's hundreds and hundreds of individuals representing the over 100 churches. So welcome, welcome. So to honor our time, we do want to open up with a prayer, and if we could just take a moment to root and kind of arrive, I'm going to go ahead and lead us in a prayer. Dear God, oh goodness, thank you for each of us here and for your love for us and our love for you and for all of creation. Guide us, Lord, as we understand more about how our faith and food are connected and how we can choose and share food to your glory, Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, welcome to the folks who just arrived or just arriving, and we just want to take a moment and share about a plan for our time. Of course, we will run about 90 minutes as usual, and we want you to, of course, feel at home in this space. So a few hospitality notes. First, we will be recording this session, just to remind you, so that it can be shared with those who are not able to attend, but the breakout rooms will not be recorded. And we will be monitoring the chat, so please feel free to address me, Becky, privately if there's anything specific that you need, or feel free to address everyone if it's something you want to share with the whole group. And please know that you don't have to take notes unless you really want to, as we are going to be emailing you next week a recording of the session as well as some implementation, quick links and tools. So you can really sit back and relax, or you can take a few notes if you like, whatever you wish. And Russ and I, we will both be available after this session to answer any questions you may have or to hear any feedback. So that is that. Also, just a specific plan for our time. We've done the welcome and prayer. Russ is going to lead us in a short introduction. We'll move on to some education, conversation, and breakout rooms, and some very important implementation. So I'm going to turn it over to Russ, and he's going to head us into food and faith.
All right. Thank you, Becky, for getting us started tonight. And thank you all for taking the time to be with us. We know it is a commitment to take 90 minutes out of your evening, and we truly appreciate you doing so. So to get us started, as always, we want to share kind of the big ideas of the session so that have an idea of where we're going.
And one other thing I did want to share is thank you so much for all the work that so many of you are already doing in this space. And thank you to all those who are just new to this space and are just curious. So we're all going to be learning together.
Yes, thank you. And so big idea number one, the food we eat can and should be aligned with our values as Christians. And we'll have some discussion about that. We're going to talk about a framework for good and for good food in general. We're going to revisit this idea that small changes can have big impact. And as always, focus on hope and remaining hopeful in this work that we're all engaged in. So with that, we'll transition into the first part. And to get started in this, I want to revisit this picture from the very first slide. If you notice, it says sustainable food is at the top. And then there are literally over 20 ideas of how you could respond to what sustainable food is. And this kind of illustrates why this particular session in the Creation Care 101 course is always a challenge for us, because there are so many stories we could tell in food. And just as an example, you might think of the biblical stories of food. In the earliest stories that we have in Genesis, we see food as a gift from God for our nourishment. It's manna from heaven. It's Jesus feeding the 5,000. You might also think of the challenging parts in the biblical stories, where we break relationship with God by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then again, in this picture that we see of the Last Supper, food is part of our restoration of relationship with God and with Jesus. And the very act of communion and the food elements that are present in that are representative of our restored relationship with God through Jesus. But of course, food is not only present in our biblical stories. We might also think of food as health. And here we continue to see the dichotomies, because food is simultaneously necessary for our very life and increasingly a cause of our death. We might also think about food as identity. Excuse me. We say things like, I'm a vegetarian or I'm a vegan. We talk about food as heritage, where we proudly share our culture in our Indian food and Mexican food, or maybe German food like we're doing now in Oktoberfest. Food is part of our celebrations. It is part of our holiday feasts. And food can also be tragic in food insecurity that we do experience in the United States, in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And finally, we think about food as a business or as a production method. We have family farms and corporate agribusinesses. We have farmers markets and multinational grocery chains. All of these things are different representation of foods. And when we think about climate, particularly, food is simultaneously one of the largest contributors to climate change, and also can be one of our biggest solutions for climate change. So food is a complex thing to talk about. There's many, many, many stories we could engage in, and we could spend weeks just on this subject. But for tonight, we're going to really focus on choices and how the choices that we make around food can be aligned with our values as Christians. And then also, but I do want to tee up, we're going to talk a little bit about food justice tonight as well. But food waste is a huge topic in food, and we cover that in session 5. Food justice is also a very broad topic, and we talk about that even more in session 7. So there's more food things to talk about, but for tonight, we're going to really focus on choice. And to get this discussion started, we're going to share a short clip from Norman Wiersbe. And Norman Wiersbe is the Gillette T. Road Distinguished Professor of Christian Theology at Duke Divinity School. He's also a senior fellow at the Canaan Institute for Ethics at Duke University. He's the author of 16 books, author or editor of 16 books, including Food and Faith, A Theology of Eating, and The Agrarian Spirit, Cultivating Faith, Community, in the Land. In this video, we're going to share, and if you have a hard time hearing this, just turn your volume up a little bit. The audio is a little bit low in this video clip. But he really does a great job of setting up the context of food and how things have changed. So enjoy Norman Wiersbe.
Churches are starting to realize that we need to be thinking about the church's place in the world, and by understanding the world, we're not just talking human culture, but also the created world, and that Christians have a responsibility for that. Farming has gone through a tremendous transformation in the last decades, and so to call what we see happening on a lot of acreage farming is really a misuse of the term, I think, because really what we're having is industrial agriculture. It's a business. And so we treat land, we treat animals like economic units. We're thinking about how to maximize productivity. And the land is now no longer populated by animals. Instead, we have large feedlots, confinement operations. And so the landscape is quite different. And with that change has come a lot of ecological trouble. Right? Soil fertility has decreased. And to keep productivity high, we've had to use a lot of fertilizers. We've had to control pests in ways that require a lot of poisons and toxins. We don't pay agricultural workers much of a wage. Many agricultural communities that were once vibrant now look like ghettos, and the people that work in the agricultural fields now live in trailer parks that look like slums. And all of this has to do with the desire for cheap food. You have to start thinking about what's an honest price for food, because the cheap food that we enjoy comes with a very heavy price. Right? It comes with a heavy price for the farmers, for the migrant workers, for the fields, the water, the animals. Everybody's paying it except us. And the church ought to be advocating for more honest pricing. It's an issue of justice. The way Christians eat can have a lot to do with what the world will be like. If we eat in ways that honor God's creation, we will at the same time have healthier lands, cleaner water, more contented and happy animals, and our health will be better too.
Thank you for sharing there, for being able to go through this with us. I want to pull out just a couple of things from the video. There were several places where Dr. Wiersbe really talked about food justice, and the justice issues are related around our food. That could be conditions of farm workers. It could be the way that we treat the land and animals that provide the food that we eat. And before we move into talking about food choices, we want to just touch briefly on this idea of food justice. You might remember that in our last session, we talked about one of the good things that has happened in the last 50 years is that we've had a huge reduction in global hunger. In 1970, 36% of the population, the world's population, was actually experiencing hunger. By 2020, we reduced that number to just 9%. It's a remarkable achievement in just 50 years. And in fact, we grow more food than we need to feed everybody at this point in time. We primarily have a distribution issue with food and challenges in actually getting food to areas where there might be war or political instability, corruption, or natural disasters that impact our ability to actually get food to people. When we think about the United States, our issue in food justice often is food insecurity. And that is just the time when people are unable to afford to buy food to eat. In the United States, up to 10% of the population, or around 35 million people, experience food insecurity at some point throughout the year. About half of that number is made up of people who are experiencing just a temporary setback. They might be living and working paycheck to paycheck, and something interrupts that flow. They might have a job loss, an injury, maybe unexpected bills that come up. And for a brief period of time, they experience food insecurity. The other half of this issue looks more like chronic issues. We have addictions and mental health and homelessness that are ongoing chronic issues that have been part of our part of our challenge with food insecurity for a long time. We know that all of these issues are impacted by structural poverty, systemic racism, and the legacy of government policies that in some cases provided, some cases helped, in some cases did not. Like all the other stories of food justice is complex, it's nuanced, but it's funny. We have Reverend Dr. Michelle Lewis is one of our board members, and in a conversation with her a little while ago, we were talking about food justice, and she said something just very, very simple. She said, "Look, if Christ were coming to dinner, what would we serve Christ?" Right? And it just made this issue so clear for me, because obviously if Christ was coming to dinner, we would serve him the best that we could, right? We'd put on a feast and a banquet and do that. And then she reminded us of this passage in Matthew 25, where Jesus is sharing a parable, and he says, "For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in?" And the king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." So we thought it was important, before we assume that everybody has the choice around food, that we actually acknowledge the issues of food justice, and acknowledge that it's a privilege to have this conversation about food choices. And that as Christians, we have a particular responsibility to the least of these brothers and sisters of mine. So keeping this food justice issues front of mind, we're going to continue into a discussion of the industrial food system, which is, of course, much lighter material. And as we transition here, I want to think about a couple of things. We could share an endless parade of stats and infographics that would really start to explain what the industrial food system is, but I think most of us have this sense that society and culture and this thing we call the industrial food system is really pushing us and trying to form us in very particular ways. We sometimes express that as being part of a consumer culture, or we talk about things like fast fashion or fast food. But if we stop to think about the messaging that is part of this, and what we hear often through advertising, or sometimes through social media posts disguised as advertising that look like social media posts, the main point seems to be a few things. There are these messages that if we do the thing that we're being asked to, that it will somehow save us time, it will save us effort, it will save us money, or provide some sort of reward that is in gratitude for the hard work that we're doing. So you might think about this advertisement. This is an old advertisement for McDonald's. The idea that you deserve a break today. You've been working so hard that you deserve a break of having McDonald's cook dinner for you. Okay. Well, initially, these things all sound great. And, who doesn't want to save time or money or be rewarded in some way? But if we stop to think about the values that underlie these things, we start to realize that these values actually are reflections of efficiency and profitability and growth, and that all of these values are transactional in nature, right? So it's interesting to step back and say, well, how does this play out in our food system? Well, this idea of efficiency shows up in the giant monocrops and the loss of biodiversity, because if we're going to efficiently grow food, we need to grow more and more and more of the same kind of food. Profitability pushes us to do things like choosing shippability over the nutrient density of food, or choosing how something looks over its health benefits. And growth. I don't know about you, but I feel like we're endlessly pushed in this chase for more. It's constantly being asked to do something better, do something faster, do something more. And all of these values, they're representative of a transactional basis of how we relate with each other, with each other and with the land and animals that make up our food system. But I want to ask, what if we switch this and we actually asked, what are the values of our faith? And what if we applied those to our decisions around food? What would that look like? So let's start with this. This again is from Matthew. It's Matthew 22. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophets hang on these two commandments." Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. If we think about it, there's three primary players in this description, right? We have God, we have our neighbor, and we have ourselves. And central to all three of these is the idea that we're to love. Love God, love our neighbor, love ourselves. And love is not a transactional value. It's not focused on efficiency and profitability. It's a relational value. So at the core of the scriptural way of looking at what good food might look like is this idea of love and relationship, and how can we mutually benefit in this process, right? So let's put this together into just a simple framework, so that we can start to think about how this might make sense and how we make some decisions. We'll start with this idea that something could be good for us. And in food, that often looks like health, right? So when we think about, is this food good for us? Often we're thinking about, is it healthy? Is it actually providing nourishment? Is it not going to impact my long-term health? Is it not going to make me gain weight, or all the various ways that health might impact us? And then the second half is neighbor. And neighbor often picks up these ideas of justice, and food justice, particularly in this case. We might think about how food is grown, how the workers on the farms are treated and paid, the living conditions of those who actually provide the food to us. And then lastly, we might think about what is good for God and creation, right? And here, this is how we treat the other parts that we share this, the other parts of creation that we share this planet with, the animals, the plants, the land. And how do we treat these things over time? So we might ask the question of, are the decisions that we're making today, are they good for us, good for neighbor, good for creation? And how do they play out over time? And in this relational aspect of this, I think in the transaction things, we would say, well, I'm going to do something that's good for me, but it might not be good for my neighbor. And we see that all the time in our industrial food system. In God's relational thing, I think he's asking us to treat this as an and relationship. How do we do something that is good for us and good for neighbor and good for creation and good over time? That's what this relational concept of good looks like. And I hope this in some ways just tries to simplify this idea and give you a context for starting to think about how we might apply this. We're going to see some examples in the second half of the material as we go along, but I want to pause here and just give us a chance to kind of digest a little bit. So you think back on the differences between the industrial system that's pushing us into transactional values and the relational values of our faith. And with that, we're going to go ahead and break into a time of conversation.
Yes. Thank you, Ross, so much. That was super helpful. The verses, the framework, and starting to connect all these dots. Thank you so much. And like Russ said, we are going to move into a time of conversation. We're going to go into the first of our breakout rooms tonight and have some small group discussion. And then we'll come back together and briefly share some meaningful takeaways. And then head into our second section of education and then implementation. But before we go into breakout rooms, we do want to do a gentle reminder of our community guidelines, just to help keep the Creation Care 101 program as meaningful and engaging, and of course, mutually honoring as possible. So these are the community guidelines: to please be present, of course, speak kindly, listen deeply and share generously, honor all voices, and be open-hearted. And with that, we are going to drop the discussion questions in the chat.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so we are going to take some time to do our discussion questions. If you just take a couple minutes, I also have these written down because I'll expand our faces so we can see each other. But we're going to do brief introductions and then talk about ways that we have experienced society and advertising forming our food choices, how that may or may not be aligned with our faith, and then talking a little bit more about their reference to the good framework and what would it be like to choose and provide food that is aligned with this. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other a little bit. And let's just go around and introduce ourselves first to get started. Who you are and where you are coming from. I'm Noni Strand. I am in Olathe, Kansas, just a suburb of Kansas City. And Sue, if you'd like to go next.
Hello, I'm Pastor Sue Tarka I serve at Overland Park Lutheran Church. I am in my home office right now, which is in Missouri. So crossing state lines. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Province. I'm with Overland Park Lutheran Church, and I live in Overland Park.
Hi, I'm Dee Morin, and I am in Bridgeton, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis.
And I'm Bob Morin, and I'm right next to Dee.
My
Great.
cat was joining us, if you didn't hear that already, so.
Well, that's wonderful. We love all creatures, great and small. So it's all a part of God's good creation. So as they talked about industrialized society, industrial food, and how food choices are impacted by advertising and society, in what ways have you experienced society and advertising forming food choices for you?
I'm retired now, but I definitely think when I was working full time, that whole run, and you have
Yes.
children waiting at home that are going to camps, and you're trying to pick them up and get them where they need to be. And it was almost, it's a reward to go out, and even if you were grabbing something quick, you didn't have to do dishes, and you didn't. So I can see how that's stuck in our culture and in our way of life. So.
Well, and we can see how seductive the advertising is. It just, it's going to make everything all better, whether it's fast or convenient or, yeah, it really affects us. And I think sometimes without even knowing it.
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
It almost facilitates the culture of we must grow and continually have more. So let's create systems that'll help that happen. And so we get kind of trapped into believing that that's going to work for us.
And it's better. Yeah.
Well, and cost, I mean, they sell it by cheaper. And you start to wonder if it's really food. And you can look at health and weight concerns in the poorest communities are obviously food driven because of cost. So cheap food is
right. It's a lot cheaper to make macaroni and cheese than it is to,
exactly,
especially if you live in a food desert and you don't have fresh fruit and vegetables available.
Well, and fresh fruits and vegetables are very expensive.
Yeah.
Orange was $1 for the cheapest orange I could find at the grocery store this weekend. So
I know. And then we think about what is the actual cost. The farm workers are not making a great wage, and farmers are so caught by the system of farming that, they're more and more of them are being forced out. So how does this all align with our faith?
you know, food and farming is a big passion of mine because I grew up watching it, observing my father who produced food for the world, right? And when I got into seminary, I started asking him questions about, you know, some of the policies that the government used to run for not planting a particular piece of land because they were trying to control the prices. It wasn't about resting the land and replenishing it, right? It was up to the farmer to rotate crops and fertilize and do what they needed to do to enhance production. But they had, you know, they started having to produce more in order to keep up with the cost because the price of, you know, corn especially was down for a lot of years. It takes a lot to manage a small family farm enterprise. You have to be really savvy nowadays, and really mindful of the costs associated with doing business. And a lot of smaller farmers weren't trained that way. They were trained on how to take care of the land. And it used to be that you could, if you did a good job of doing that, it would be fine. You would be able to live off of that. Not anymore.
Yeah.
Well, now with all the pesticides and all the fertilizers and the runoffs in the creeks and rivers and that, I mean, you know, farmers are very smart about what they're doing so that they don't ruin the resources around them.
Well, and it's a never-ending cycle. I've talked to my dad about this too, about the kinds of fertilizers that are used, and you know, you fix one problem and it causes another, and there's always something that pops up that isn't dealt with. The plants get there's resistance, and it's like whack-a-mole, right? You really can't keep up with it. And then I think there's this, I'm sorry, Noni, this identity thing about, you know, not having weeds in your farm, and that farmer next door isn't taking care of his property or his plants very well because there are weeds. And yet, you know, if we weren't caught up in this notion of being perfect and having a pristine farm, we wouldn't be using all that stuff and probably causing us many problems.
That's good.
Well, again, it goes back to the cheaper stuff. It's cheaper to put chemicals on it, perhaps, or sometimes it's just educational. I know one of the things I see in rural Kansas is there's very few farms that do cover crops. So they have this dirt pile that sits out there all winter, and it erodes the topsoil, which is what they need. It's all going into the rivers, into the creeks, and into the lakes. And, you know, so then they got to pump more chemicals in it to make it perform. All about cost effectiveness. You know, do they want to waste cost on a cover seed for, right now I can't think of green mulch, but like barley or something like that they plant to simply grow, and then they, you know, overplant it once it dies. So, and no-till gardening is something that they're trying to promote to keep costs down and is actually better for the soil. But so changing the way, instead of faster, cheaper, maybe looking at things that are, you know, more sustainable.
And I think we've created systems that trap people into these things. And that's, I think farming is a really good example of that. Is it gets to the point where how do you change and still make a living, because it's been created that way. And well, they're going to talk a little bit more about farming, but that's a really interesting topic. And that ties in with the next question about the good framework, about good for us, good for neighbor, good for creation. What would it be like to choose and provide food that's aligned with that? Lisa, you talked about different farming methods. What are some other things that might help us to be more in alignment with this good framework?
Buying local. Instead
Farmers
of
market.
kind of investigating where especially produce is coming from, and if it's shipped from California versus grown here. So there isn't all the cost of gas and it's affected the environment. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I think about food packaging too.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I took a class this summer on eco-theology, and I ended up doing a study on the Compost Collective, and I went and visited their farm and learned a ton about the methane cycle and just composting and how much food is wasted and winds up in landfills, and you know, just the fact the amount that food is wasted. It's not even about packaging even, but we create so much garbage by packaging food, and that gets to the local thing. I've actually started not even bagging my vegetables when I go to the grocery store, just because of the plastic thing, right? I don't why do grocery stores keep buying plastic bags? You don't really need them to put your tomatoes in. If you're paying attention to what you're doing, right?
Yeah, and just avoiding plastic. And maybe we talked about that last time. I can't remember, but just that avoiding plastic.
Huge.
It's everywhere.
It's very hard.
I'm really becoming more conscious of that.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead. We can talk more, but let's go ahead and we're going to pick up our video again and continue with the next education section. Thanks for all your great insights.
Think about them. We're going to continue in the education portion of what we're doing, and we're going to hear a little bit more about some of the science and the things that we can practically do around food, and how the choices that we make with food actually do impact the climate. So before we go there, I'm going to revisit just real quickly this graphic from Project Drawdown. We talked about this last week, and just as a quick refresher, the gray box in the middle is the atmosphere. These rainbow colored things on the left are actually the inputs or the sources of greenhouse gases. And we might think about things like electricity production, food and agriculture, which we're talking about today, industry and transportation. On the right side is nature helping us out and taking those greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. Those are things like our forests and land sinks, the coastal ocean sinks, our big kelp forests, for example. And you notice that 60% remains in the atmosphere because we're out of balance. We put 60% more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than the Earth can handle. And those gases stay in the atmosphere year after year. So today we're really focused here on the sources with food and agriculture and land use. And the thing I love about the Project Drawdown is that they take all of these solutions. There's 160 different solutions, and they rank them by the amount of impact that they have. And they assign this numeric value, which is gigatons of CO2 equivalent. That doesn't really mean anything to us, but it can give us an idea of the comparative impact. And this is where it gets interesting. So the number one and number two things that we can do, that we have solutions available to us right now, are both food related. And the first one is this, is simply reducing food waste. And that's things like composting, which Lisa just mentioned. And we're going to talk about that a lot actually in session 5. And then the second thing is this idea of plant-rich diets. It turns out that the makeup of what we eat, and then we're also going to see how that is grown, the combination of those two things have a huge impact in the climate. So this is kind of setting this up, and the reason we're starting with food is exactly this, because food is the biggest potential solution for us, and it's also a way that we make decisions about 3 times a day, the food we choose to eat. So with that, I'm going to transition. We're going to share Vox and the University of California Climate Lab did this great video that actually talks about the impacts of our diet and on climate. So I'm going to share my screen with that, and Well, it's about 5 minutes, so it goes very quickly. And we'll move forward. So
I have to admit that when it comes to food, I'm a total sucker. Whether it's sugar or grease or carbs, pretty much bring it on. And I spend a lot of time in Montana. So for me, that medium rare grass-fed ribeye steak, pretty much as good as it gets. I know, I don't do it often. And when I do, I gotta admit, I feel a little conflicted. And that's for a lot of reasons, including the planet. But how big of a problem is what I eat? I mean, does it really make much of a dent in something as huge as global warming? It turns out that what we put on our plates matters a lot.
About 25% of all the global climate change problems we're seeing can be attributed back to the food and the choices that we're actually making about what we eat on a daily basis. This is greater than all the cars on the planet. In fact, it's about twice as much global warming pollution as the cars.
Ben Holton and Maya Almaroz study the connection between climate and diet at the University of California, Davis. They track how the way we produce food creates greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming. With their data, the team has crunched the numbers to figure out how much carbon pollution is produced by different foods and different diets.
A lot of people feel really helpless when it comes to climate change, like they can't make a difference. And what our research is showing is that your personal decisions really can have a big impact.
So take that grass-fed ribeye steak I love. If you really look at everything that went into making a single serving of beef, you end up emitting around 330 grams of carbon. That's like driving a car 3 miles. Now, if I choose to have chicken instead, there's more than a 5-fold drop in emissions. Switch to fish, and you see the number go down even more. Now, look at veggies. If I swapped beef out entirely for lentils, well, I'm down to practically nothing. So why does beef, and lamb too for that matter, pack such a powerful punch to the planet? Livestock accounts for a little over 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. If that sort of seems low to you, consider it's about equal to transportation. We're talking all the cars, trucks, planes, trains, and ships on the planet combined. This is partly because ruminant animals like cows and sheep, they're just gassy. And the methane they produce is at least 25 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Plus, it takes a lot of land, fertilizer, and about 1 billion tons of grain to feed all that livestock.
And you could feed 3.5 billion people with that grain. If we were just directly eating these grains ourselves, it would eliminate a lot of the CO2 that's emitted from cattle production.
So it's clear that meat has a pretty big carbon load. But it's also worth remembering that not all livestock is raised equally. In parts of the American West, for instance, ranchers are working to raise livestock in ways that actually help restore the land. And they're experimenting with ways that soil and grasslands can be used to keep carbon pollution out of the air. But even these sustainable ranchers will really tell you we're probably eating too much meat.
I know a lot of people who, if you don't serve them meat for lunch or dinner, they're kind of like, well, when is the meat coming out?
It's to the point now where the US actually has one of the highest meat footprints per capita. So what about not eating meat at all? Vegan is the way to go for the least impact on the planet, but it's not that much different in terms of emissions than, say, a vegetarian diet. And the team found that the environmental impact of the Mediterranean diet is pretty similar to vegan and vegetarian diets. It's a lot less meat heavy than what Americans are used to, so fish and poultry a few times a week, beef maybe once a month, plenty of plant-based foods, and of course, loads of olive oil.
Eliminating like 90% of your meat intake is more important than eliminating all of your meat. We don't all have to be vegan. We don't all even have to be vegetarian. If we can just reduce our meat intake, every little bit helps. And if you can bring it down a lot, you can help the climate a lot.
If we all just switched to a Mediterranean diet, it could actually solve 15% of global warming pollution by 2050.
If everyone were to move toward it, that is equivalent to taking somewhere around 1 billion cars off of the streets in terms of vehicle emissions each year. So that kind of a footprint is big time.
But say you still want more meat than the Mediterranean diet recommends. Just cutting down your portion size to the doctor recommended 4 ounces can reduce your emissions by half. That's huge.
In fact, the doctors are telling us we're eating about twice as much meat as we really need for a healthy diet.
The good news is we are listening to our doctors. In the last decade, there's been a 19% drop in the amount of beef we eat.
All these things that you're already being told are good for you also happen to be good for the planet.
So what we eat really is a big part of the climate puzzle. I mean, we may not all be able to afford an electric car or putting solar panels on our house, but we all have to eat every day. And these choices we make can add up to really big numbers. And since meat has a pretty big carbon load, we need to be thoughtful about how much we eat. As for that ribeye steak that I really love, I am honestly trying to cut back. Maybe just a smaller piece of steak, or simply swapping out a meat dish for a veggie burger. It may seem like a small thing, but it really does add up to big impacts.
Lisa, and I'm going to go ahead and we're going to, before we move on, I just wanted to kind of pull a couple things out of this discussion, and really think about. I think they did a great job of kind of teeing up this idea that the makeup of our diet can actually have a huge impact on the climate. And I don't know if you caught the numbers, but the typical American diet that's very meat heavy actually has a carbon load of around 5,000, and just switching to a Mediterranean diet drops that all the way down to less than 1,000. And so that's like a 500% reduction, right? I mean, or 400% reduction, something like that. It's a huge chunk coming out of it. So this is a good example of that small changes can have big impacts. And they kind of touched on in there, you might have caught the part in the middle about the American ranchers that are experimenting with how the ways that they can integrate animals into actually doing regenerative agriculture projects. We're going to share just a 3-minute clip on that gives a really good basis for why that works and what it looks like. So I'm going to start that, and here we go.
My name is Passion Murray, and I make compost in the city of Detroit. I want to share with you a story about soil, farming, and compost, and how it can be a solution for climate change. Climate change is a big problem. It's happening because there's too much carbon in our atmosphere, but carbon is not our enemy. It's the building block of life. Everything alive is made of it. It's us. The problem and the solution are a simple matter of balance. Let's step back and look at the 5 pools where carbon is stored on planet Earth. Starting about 500 million years ago, when plants came onto land, carbon began to cycle in an amazing balance. A balance that allowed for life as we know it to evolve. Then one life form, us, figured out how to extract carbon from the fossil pool. We've been burning it for energy, putting it into play, and disrupting that balance. How we manage land and do agriculture is moving even more carbon from the soil and biosphere into the atmosphere. Specifically, we've moved 880 gigatons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is heating up the planet and destabilizing our climate. Now, the oceans have absorbed a lot of this excess carbon, which is resulting in warming temperatures, acidification, and accelerating a mass extinction of sea life. In order to stop global warming, of course we have to stop burning fossil carbon. The big question is, where do we put the excess carbon to get the cycle back in balance? Remember when I said that soil was a part of the solution? It literally is. Plants, with sunlight and water, perform photosynthesis. They pull carbon in from the air and turn it into carbohydrates, sugars. Then they pump some of those sugars down through their roots to feed microorganisms who use that carbon to build soil. There we go. Carbon moved. The plants pull it in and the soil stores it. Nature's living technology is amazing. Scientists have recently discovered that applying a thin layer of compost one time sets up an ongoing positive feedback loop that brings more and more carbon into the soil each year. In concert with our regenerative practices like not tilling the soil, planting trees and cover crops, and good grazing, we can build and retain gigatons of soil carbon. This is carbon farming. This is regenerative agriculture. More carbon in the ground is good for us. It makes healthy soil. Healthy soil makes for more nutritious food, and it holds way more water so crops are more resilient in the face of drought. That's good news for families, farmers like me, and everyone that eats. The way we grow our food, fuel, and even our clothes either puts carbon into the atmosphere or pulls it down into the ground. The regeneration of soil is the task of our generation. Our health, the health of the soil, and the health of the planet are one and the same.
So, and I hope you enjoyed that. Actually, it's so that the soil story was actually done by Kiss the Ground, and some of you may have seen the Kiss the Ground documentary, which is available on Netflix right now. That's an hour and a half roughly. It's a much deeper dive into that topic, and if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth checking out.
Really good.
Yeah, really good. So. We're going to let's shift gears a little bit now. We've kind of set the stage a little bit, and we've talked about the ways that the type of diet that we pursue actually impacts climate. We've talked about the ways that food is grown and how that might impact climate. And so if we're summarizing these things, we did exactly that. And I hope you heard throughout this idea that small changes, sustained over time, done by enough people, really do add up to big impacts. How food grown obviously also matters. And so if I were going to try to kind of wrap up this section, I know we've covered a lot of ground and it's been a lot thrown at you. I would say this. Think back to that idea of eating with the values of our faith. Choose good food, things that are good for us, good for neighbor, and good for creation, all at the same time if we can. Obviously, our neighbors are part of this discussion and part of that good choices. And then my doctor had this sign up in his exam room and said, eat whole foods, mostly plants, and not too much. And that's a really good summary of just a very good approach to this. And by whole foods, he specifically meant not processed foods. So we're moving back towards fresh fruits and vegetables, whole vegetables, whole grains, as minimally processed as possible. And then the last thing, this idea of regenerative organic farming, it actually has a tremendous potential for impacting climate. But right now it's just a potential. And it's actually really important that if we have the ability to, supporting small local regenerative organic farmers is a huge step in actually moving this work forward. It's really critical in changing the way our farming is done, because right now conventional farming really adds a significant amount of CO2 to the atmosphere. Regenerative organic farming takes that back and puts it in the ground. The challenging part, 96 or 94% of our farmland in the United States is conventionally farmed. So the vast majority of our farmland is actually hurting us instead of helping us at this point. And we have an opportunity to support that change. So we'll move into implementation, and Becky's going to just walk us through some ideas of ways that we can respond as a faith community. And then we're going to revisit our friends at Hope Community Church, which is our fictional case study church, and walk you through their implementation.
Yes, thank you so much, Russ. That was super helpful. And yes, we are going to dive into some implementation and put as much as we can right at your fingertips to make this as simple and accessible as possible, and convenient as possible as well. So this implementation is definitely focused on creation friendly food, the food that Russ has been sharing about. That would be mostly fruits and veggies, some grains and beans, a little meat, and mostly organic and local. So, and that all of this really fitting that good framework model of good for us, good for neighbor, good for creation. So first and foremost, how do we just easily choose this as an option? And so whether we're shopping or wanting it delivered, want to introduce you to two very specific great options that are online. And the first one is Misfits. And the Misfits is, we will be sending you links to this. They provide organic produce and sustainably sourced groceries delivered at up to 40% off grocery store prices. And they do that, they deliver in almost every state and every zip code in the United States. And almost a third of what's grown in the US never actually gets harvested because it doesn't meet the standards of traditional grocery stores. And all of that goes to waste. So about a third of the organic produce goes to waste. And so this is how Misfits is able to do this. They work directly with the farmers and the makers, and they rescue that organic produce that otherwise would go to food waste, actually, and deliver it to our door, or your door, all of our doors, and then they pass on the savings to us, which is fantastic. It's like mutually flourishing. And the fruits and vegetables and produce, they just don't look perfect. They'll have a little, they might just look a little funny, or they might look great, but they're totally, as they come out of creation organically. So anyway, that's a great option, easy to use. The second option we want to introduce you to is Azure store. Azure has a standard and is a store right online. They too deliver to almost every state and zip code in the United States. And they have a full selection of already curated, healthy, organic, regenerative, and natural products. And they do this at affordable prices and bulk prices too. So this is an option, great option for our churches wanting to order in bulk, or at home wanting to order in individual quantities. They just really believe that everyone should have access to high quality, organic, non-GMO foods, and just bring that all together. So it's easy to find. And then the other thing to easily choose from is, we are giving you, if you don't already know it already, we're sending you a CSA finder. CSA is community supported agriculture. And this finder helps you find your closest CSA, your closest farm, your closest farmers markets, right to your zip code. And then you can put in the words regenerative organic, and it will just pull those farms and CSAs and farmers markets that have that specific type of creation friendly food. So hoping to make it much easier for you, or you can just go hunt these things out in your grocery store, which you can find them, but these things might make them a little faster.
Yes.
So second part of implementation, after we just kind of finally easily choose, is to making it accessible to all. So two ideas a lot of churches are doing this across the country and having great success with is consider hosting a weekly CSA at your church, or hosting a weekly farmers market at your church, of which you can find with the links that we're going to send you. And then third is to model it. We've talked a lot about remembering that our biggest impact might be the changes we inspire in others. And it's one way to model it is just to do some themed church meals using creation friendly food, like pasta bars and soup and salad bars, things like that, that bring in those creation friendly foods. So those are just a couple very specific implementation ideas, and some tools that we will put at your fingertips when we send those emails. And Russ is going to take us real quickly and show us how this can be used and expressed in Hope Community Church. Back to you.
Thank you. And great job, Beck, in pulling those together. Thank you for doing that. So welcome back to Hope Community Church. This is our fictional church of 200 members. The church is in a suburb of a larger town. And you might remember from our last session that they recently formed a green team and very proudly took a picture of their team. So like you, they're going through this session, and as they go back to church and have their next meeting, they started with this idea of, let's take stock of the ways that we actually use food in church and what might those be. So they started first thinking about church functions. They thought, oh, we have a youth group, and they meet, roughly 30 weeks out of the year. There's about 15 students. You do the math, that's 450 meals. We have some large adult luncheon or some adult luncheons and dinners. This might be things like a men's dinner or a women's luncheon. And when they added those up, they realized that those were over 250 meals together. There's an all-church picnic where they feed about 200 people. The office staff at the church actually has catered in meals a couple times a month. And when you add those things up, that's another 120 meals. We serve coffee at church every week. And then the church also hosts vacation Bible schools. So there's 1,000 snacks that are giving out over the 2-week period that they do vacation Bible school. So, and then finally they thought about, oh, we actually support a local food bank. We donate as a church over 500 cans and boxes of food. And then when they added all this up, they realized that, wow, this is over 1,000 meals, 1,000 opportunities to actually make a difference just in our church functions. And not to mention the 2,600 coffees and 1,000 snacks and the donated food that the church actually gives. One of the members of the Green Team remembered that we've not only been talking about the activities at church, but our activities at home. So they thought, well, hey, well, let's see what the impact is at home. They thought, well, we've got roughly 200 members at church. They eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They have a couple cups of coffee and a soda every day. And when you add all of that up, that's 219,000 meals a year. It's literally 200 times the impact of the church. And they thought back to this idea that within our church communities, the biggest impact on the climate and on change that we might have might just actually be the change we inspire in others. And this particular point really drove it home for me. Again, the church had 1,000 meals to make an impact in, but the people, the members of the church, 219,000 meals. In continuing to do this, they wanted to think about access to food. What does access to good, healthy food in our community look like? So they drew a 15-mile circle around the church and said, what does this actually look like? And so within that circle, there were 2 national grocery chains, and they had some organic selection, so there were some choices there. There was a health food store with mostly supplements and a little bit of healthy food. But they were shocked to see that there were 15 convenience stores just within the same radius of the church and over 20 fast food restaurants. There was a farmer's market available, but it was over a half an hour away and met on a Tuesday, so it wasn't the most convenient thing for their church. And as they looked for regenerative organic food, they realized that there wasn't any retail outlets actually selling it in their immediate vicinity. So this was a real mix as they thought about it. There's a little bit of access in some of the larger stores, but it just really drove that point home of how easy and convenient unhealthy food can be. And then they visited the food bank, and in talking to them, they realized that the food bank actually serves over 500 people a month, but there's actually no fresh produce and no organic food available in the food bank. So after taking stock, they sat down and thought, well, let's make a plan. What can we do? How can we respond as a church? And the first thing they wanted to focus on was improving access. And this idea of actually setting up a CSA drop point at the church seemed like the easiest thing for them to get started with. So they chose that as the option they wanted to pursue, as well as sharing these ideas like Misfits and Azure with their congregation. The other thing is that they felt like it was important to help the food bank. And they wondered if we do set up the CSA drop point and it actually works, could we purchase a few extra shares and actually donate that to the food bank to get some fresh fruits and vegetables? And the third part was that they wanted to educate by example. So they thought back to all those meals that happen at church, and the women's luncheon was coming up, and they thought, well, let's try this. Let's see if we can host a creation-friendly women's luncheon at church and see how it goes. So with this plan in place, they started their implementation. Also, they thought that they should gather some of these ideas together and actually put them on the church's website so that they could share it easily as they do things. So we move towards implementation. The first part, if you remember, was to set up a CSA drop point. And in looking around, they actually visited several farmers markets and then found finally a couple that was doing regenerative organic farming in an urban setting not far from the church. And excited about it. And as they opened conversation with this couple and the small farm, they agreed that the church would, or that the farm would actually bring to church just the CSA drop-offs every week and host a small farm stand to actually sell any excess produce that they might have. This ended up being popular with the congregants, and over 15 people actually signed up to pick up CSAs every week. This ended up being an example of something good for the farmer, good for the community, good for the church, good for the community, good for the health of everybody involved. We moved on, and the green team actually just asked a simple question. In church one day, a member stood up and said, "We'd like to give some fresh vegetables to our food bank. Would anybody be willing to sponsor a CSA farm share that we could actually donate to the food bank?" To their surprise, 3 people did. So they started actually adding weekly fresh fruits and vegetables right into the food bank. And this was another easy thing that they could do. And of course, we have the women's luncheon. So after some work and planning and some pushback of people who thought, we can't, we've got to serve meat and all of these things, they settled on a soup and salad combination for the luncheon. And to help in this educational effort, they actually created a little sign that said, "Where's the chicken?" And your lunch is actually saving the planet. Learn how at Hope Community Church /Creation Care. And just with this simple thing, they were able to actually start to share this message with their broader community. So this is just a couple of these ideas. And with this initial success, they started to think about what else might we be able to do. And this idea of expanding creation-friendly food to even more church events. One of the other things that came up is as people were getting these produce from CSAs, a lot of people didn't know what to do with some of these, with some of the vegetables that were coming in. So this idea of holding some small classes on food prep and sharing recipes is starting to come up in Hope Community Church. And they're just continuing to think about more ways that they can inspire change. And the simple signs that they shared at the luncheon are a good example. So if we summarize these things, Hope Community Church is really seeing this idea of our biggest impact can be the inspiring change in others, particularly in their congregation. This idea of small changes yielding big impacts. And this idea that we eat, or what we eat, matters a lot, as well as how our food is grown. And this experience of working with their community and their church is just really inspiring hope that even though these changes are small to start, they're planting seeds and these can grow over time. And it gives us all hope as we move forward. So thank you for spending a little bit of time with Hope Community Church. And we're going to wrap up tonight with going back into a breakout room. So we have a chance to kind of talk about these things.
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to take some time to talk about these things as well, to reflect on the Mediterranean plant-based foods and their health and how that might inform what we do at church. And then if we're to model this at home and at church, what are some steps we could take? So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so again we can see each other. Was there anything in that inspired you to think about how we might model this and how we might do things differently in our congregations?
Absolutely. We, at Overland Park Lutheran, we include a meal with our VBS program.
Cool.
And I was asked to do a menu this year because the person in the family who's always done the cooking didn't want to do the menu, right? So I did a menu, and one night I said, well, we're just going to have a vegetarian meal, and it was going to be, a tomato-based pasta.
Mhm.
Well, they didn't like that. We had to have chicken nuggets. And my issue was, you know, I'm making the menu. I'm going to do vegetarian because I care about the planet. I just didn't communicate that that's why I did that. Right. And so it just went to show me how hard it is to change our habits. Right.
Mhm.
Oh, we got to have meat at every meal because we're feeding the kids. We got to have a protein. Well, that's not necessarily true. And we can eat differently at church by setting an example of caring for creation and being healthier ourselves and all of that.
Mhm.
So
There's definitely, when you try to suggest different ways of eating to people, they become very passionate about.
well, and food, the gifts at our church are a lot of related to food and our ministries. And so this misfit
Misfits
thing, you
market.
know,
Mhm.
you get
Mhm.
stuff for 40% less. I mean, we could be buying so much more food for our mini food pantry and giving our recipients fresh stuff.
Mhm.
Managing that might be a challenge because we don't have a lot of place to store the amount of food we would want, but we would also be able to have a higher volume of food to meet the demand that we have for the same amount that we're paying for all this canned and processed food that we're sticking in the pantry. So yeah, it's going to take some education and some changing of habits and different ways of thinking to incorporate any of this kind of stuff into the life of the church. I already eat a Mediterranean diet. I find it very healthy.
Mhm.
So I'm happy to know how that its impact is far, you know, is a huge impact.
Mhm. And Lisa, you said baby steps, and I think that's the thing too. It's a process to help people to think about things differently, because food is very personal, and it's ingrained in our culture, in our heritage, in traditions, and
Comfort.
yeah, huge, all those things. So but it's also can have a huge impact. But sometimes the kids can be the ones that can help you with that too. Dee and Bob, ideas from your end of the world.
Well, I mean, I think that just cutting back on the amount of meat. You know, I mean, there's days that, you know, we go without eating any meat. We're not vegetarians, but I mean, we
Yeah.
do that. And I mean, some vegetarian and vegan meals are actually just as tasty as, you know, ones with meat in it. There's a vegan restaurant here in St. Louis that I can't remember what dish I had, but I mean, it was delicious. And, you know, and it had, I don't know if it was tofu it had in there, but I mean, it had stuff that tasted, like I said, just as good as meat. So,
yeah,
you know, it's much better for it. So.
I like the idea of the congregation kind of going through a little bit of analysis first and almost proving it to themselves instead of it being this big uphill battle with a few people. I don't know how you would get your whole congregation involved. We're doing a Bible study at our church, a series, and we're starting with creation care. So hopefully that group of about maybe 30 or 40 people will be enough to kind of get the ball rolling, because I think then you almost convince yourself versus having, you know, a smaller group try and get everyone.
Yeah.
What I have a question on that CSA.
Uh-huh.
What does the A stand for?
Community supported agriculture.
Agriculture.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I'll send the link so that you can find one that's close to you. The other thing too that that might be of help is if you have people that garden in your congregation, you know, if they plant an extra tomato plant or a little bit more lettuce, and then they contribute that to that food pantry that you talked about, Sue, so that
we do that.
They do that. That's good. Or to the local food pantry, so that they kind of are invested in that. I think so many people who are poor and who are food insecure have no access to fresh vegetables and fruits. And that it's a huge barrier to try to be healthier. And so, yeah, there's
We
a
have community garden also at our church.
Oh, wow.
And I know that we have, you know, they do not use pesticides and herbicides.
Oh, that's great.
So they're very conscientious about the way the gardens are tended and taken care of. And Lisa, you might know a little bit more about it than me, but it's a neat thing. People actually walk by the garden as a way to relax. I mean, we have lots of dog walkers and people walking in our neighborhood, and they purposely walk by our garden because it's a place of respite for them. And so yeah, it's a really neat thing for our congregation. I just wish that we would be, and we don't sponsor it. It's another community partnership.
Oh, I was going to ask you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
or even to get somebody from that garden come and talk to your church.
Oh yeah, we are trying to do a little bit more with them. The pandemic kind of made an issue, but I did a blessing of the garden to try to connect the church and
that's good.
The gardeners last year at right around Pentecost, and just getting us all connected again post pandemic has been a little bit of a challenge.
Yeah. Well,
I know in our food pantry too, and we have a lot of gardeners at our church. But the problem is fresh produce is hard to make accessible because it spoils or it gets too hot or it gets too cold so it is more challenging to give like we have a community thing with Panera where we get this bread and I've been told it doesn't go well in the food pantry. That shocked me, but again, it might be the fact that it's breads that are made without preservatives, so it spoils fast. It needs to be refrigerated or something, and you can't have it in a box out front. Yeah. So that's challenging. How do we get it from point A to point B?
I'm just thinking out loud here, Lisa, but one thing we could do is just like these folks were suggesting is to host a food giveaway on a very specific day that would combine, here's our Panera offering, here are all the things that we're getting from our gardeners at church. The way it goes now, Noni and Dee and Bob, is that our gardeners at church bring their boxes of tomatoes on Sunday morning, and guess who gets all the tomatoes? It's the people in church, you know.
I did see some in the box though.
And so the sharing ethos is there. It just is not getting to the people that probably have the most need.
Yeah. Well, both your congregations are doing wonderful things. This is great. This is so inspiring.
It is.
This is good. But we see the impacts that food choices have. And that's I think what the next steps, the takeaways are, to think about those choices, to think about accessibility, especially for those who, I was even thinking for shut-ins in our congregations, if they're not getting fresh food, is there a way we can help them? And then also then, how do we model it? I always thought it would be fun to do a Lenten series and use different choices about food, and to even use that as a way to educate people and tie it to our faith. I think that's the huge piece, is that we do this because we love God, we love our neighbor, and we have been given so much, and that we do this deeply steeped in our faith. And that's the beginning point. And so it's not just because certainly it's healthier and it's the right thing to do and it's good, but it's deeply embedded in who we are as people of faith. And that's what makes it a little bit maybe easier to help people to see that. The changes
I like all the data that has been shared today about the impact, because I think so many people hear climate change and they go, oh, this is just way too big for me to participate. I can't, I don't know what to do. And my one little action is not going to make a difference, but it really and truly does. And if we can help people quantify that,
Yes.
and connect that to their daily choices, then they're going to feel like they're actually contributing and being part of the solution instead of just getting so overwhelmed by the problem that they just give up and don't do anything.
Right.
Did everybody or did anybody do that assessment that was sent in the link?
Mm-hmm.
Was anybody as shocked as I was about the results of it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I found it
Yes.
very depressing. But what I did like is that it had all these lovely suggestions and it gave you what the impact would be.
Yes.
And some of it was like, for example, one I looked at was taking public transportation or riding my bike to work one day a week and how big an impact that would be.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked it up and lo and behold, it's 8 miles and it's all bike lanes all the way to my work and back. I drove it in my car. Because I'm like, I can't do that. And then I'm like, I probably could, not this winter maybe, but maybe I could do that.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Get to work too. I mean, but there was a lot of, that amazed me by that one day a week, how big a difference it would make.
Yeah.
But there were lots of things and you could pick and choose.
And if you multiply that, if you multiply that. And Sue, you were asking about the 3.5 Earths. So that, what that is if everyone in the world lived like you do, and you live better than a lot of people, it sounds like, it would take 3.5 Earths to support the population.
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, it can't possibly take me. And actually my score was 4.1.
Okay.
So Lisa's doing way better than me, but she lives close to church. I'm now commuting, 14 miles one way to my job. And so I may just start working at home to kind of lessen my carbon footprint on my work. But, it's, and I gotta go back and look at that and really, really assess and see if it's a better score. But it's hard.
But as we make those small changes, and that, it doesn't mean that we have to like sacrifice and go back to the dark ages and live with nothing. No, we actually, man, if I rode my bike 8 miles to work, gosh, just think how much healthier I'd be.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's benefits. And oftentimes like changes in buildings and grounds can save money. And so there's a lot of benefits that if we can get past that initial, oh, it's going to be so hard, it's going to be horrible. No, when we take steps, incremental steps, it can really make huge differences. And if we're all doing it collectively, just think the power of the people of faith. It's huge, huge. Well, you guys just inspire me. This is wonderful. Do you have any questions or thoughts as we kind of draw to a close tonight?
I just thought it was excellent presentation and good discussion. It was energizing. It really was.
I know.
It makes you feel like there are things that are possible to do, and I like that.
And I like their focus on hope. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One of the things I'd like to do at church, Lisa, you'll appreciate this, is do the Lutherans, Restoring Creation shared that example of the charter, the charter at church to kind of make the commitment to, and so just even taking stock of the food we do at church. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, one of our families, parents of our children, asked for healthier choices for our fellowship hour. And thank God that didn't come from the pastor who, knows that. And so that was, that's a small step and a way to start going, we really ought to take a look at this.
And you don't have to say, okay, we're taking away all the cookies and we're only going to have carrots. You say,
no,
we have carrots along with our cookies. And then, you know,
Yeah.
slowly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. Well, our next meeting will be Tuesday, December 13th at 7. We'll meet again here. Again, I'll be sending a recording and some resources in the next few days for tonight. And if you need anything from me in particular, if you want to bounce some ideas off, or if there's any way I can help you find resources, please just give me a call or an email. But tonight I would like to, oh, go ahead.
Would you say the date was the next one?
Tuesday, December 13th.
13th. It's the second Tuesday of each month.
Second Tuesday. Yep.
Oh, I already have it on there. Okay.
Look at you. And so let's close our time together with prayer tonight. Let us pray. Oh God, we are so grateful for all that you have given to us and for this time together that we've had tonight. You inspire us with your hope, with your vision, and with ideas for how we can better care for all that you have made. We thank you for the work that Sue and Lisa and Dee and Bob and others are doing in their congregations, and pray that you continue to give us ideas and lead us and help us to find ways to truly love our neighbors, ourselves, and all that you have made. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.